Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to this session. I am Chandini Jain. I am CEO and co-founder of Auquan. And today, I am going to talk about RAG AI, or Retrieval Augmented Generation, and how it overcomes the known shortcomings of generative AI to power knowledge-intensive tasks in financial services. Let me quickly introduce Auquan first. Auquan is an AI startup. We enable our end customers in financial services, which are typically investment banks, asset owners, asset managers, private equity firms, to make better decisions by finding relevant information from a mountain of unstructured data significantly faster than if they were to do this manually. We connect to all of the world's unstructured data, we bring it in-house, run it through our RAG AI system, and surface only the most material information for the end user customized to their use case. But the question is, why do we even need RAG in the first place? Well, I should have been on that slide. But here we go. So for any information retrieval or search system to be enterprise-ready, it needs to meet three core criteria. First, it needs to be comprehensive. It needs to connect to all of the data sources where relevant information can exist, and it needs to have access to real-time updates to that information. Second, it needs to be transparent so that users can build trust in the system and use it downstream in their workflows. And the third and most important, it needs to be accurate. The users need to know that the information that they're going to be using downstream is actually credible if it is going to power financial services use cases. And the problem is, standard out-of-the-box LLMs fail on all three criteria. The current LLMs are basically a snapshot of the past, which means any information, for example, on changes to the macro environment, any new regulatory updates, any changes in the company-specific information, anything that happened beyond their training cutoff date is not accessible to them. And second, they're trained for generic tasks, so they don't have access to the niche custom data sets that are required to power financial services use cases. There's an analogy that I like. If you think that language models like BERT were a smart high school graduate, then large language models are basically an even smarter college graduate. But if you're on a desk in an investment bank, what you really want is that smart college graduate should have undergone the intensive training that your bank provides so they know how to run due diligence on an M&A transaction. And LLMs fail to do that. Second, they're basically black boxes. They do not cite the sources from which the information that they're generating the response was derived. And that makes it really hard for a user to build trust into the system. And third, there's the infamous problem of hallucinations. Generating linguistically coherent, but factually inaccurate, or sometimes completely fabricated responses. And if you throw that into the mix, the problems of using standard LLMs to power financial services becomes quite obvious. Try to imagine that there is an AI copilot that is developed for risk managers to help them better understand the risk profile of their investments. If this AI copilot is generating a risk profile without having access to the most recent macro changes, for example, the recent interest rate hikes, if it is powering this without having access to the recent regulatory changes, that can yield to catastrophic losses. And if it generates a hallucinated response to a question like, does this company have any previous accusations of bribery or fraud? That is a regulatory nightmare. So then, how do financial services participants access all of the benefits of large language models and overcome these pitfalls? And that is where RAG, or Retrieval Augmented Generation, comes in. It's a cutting-edge enhancement to generative AI that was powered by Meta 2 years back. And essentially, it combines the retrieval component of a search system like Google with the generative component of an LLM. It has access to a continuously updating knowledge base, just like Google would. And using that, it is able to identify information that answers the user's query. But the benefit is, unlike Google, which would point you to where the answer exists, it can leverage an LLM to actually give you the answer, which is not only coherent, but is also rooted in fact. So here's how a RAG system works. The starting point, just like a generative AI system, is a query. It could be a user-generated query, or it could be a system-generated query. But instead of a generative AI system where this query is directly fed to the LLM to generate a response, In a RAG system, this query is first embedded using an embedding model, and then it is matched against a knowledge base to identify information that could potentially answer this query. This knowledge base is also embedded using the same embedding model and stored in a vector database like Pinecone or VV8 or Quadrant. And what you get from here are documents that could potentially answer the original query. Now that context and the original query are combined together, and that is the prompt that is given to the LLM. Additional points, like making sure you cite your sources, or to make sure that the information, the response that is generated, only takes the context that is provided to it, is also handled at the prompt stage. And then the response that is generated now from adding this retrieval component completely changes the whole game. The users now know that the response that is generated is from credible, it's from accurate information. It has the most recent updates because they control the knowledge base from which the context was generated. They know that this is comprehensive because they know that the knowledge base itself is comprehensive. And most important, they know that the information is not hallucinated. And if they want to verify, because RAG cites the sources, they can actually go to the source of the information and verify that. And now when I say that, the use cases of a RAG system in financial services become quite obvious. Any workflow that is knowledge intensive, that requires looking through a large amount of data to make decisions, is an obvious candidate. But I'm going to focus on one of them for now, which is enhancing due diligence processes for private companies. So this pre-screening and due diligence process typically comes after deal sourcing stage in a private equity firm. And the idea here is to conduct an initial evaluation of the company to decide if this is an opportunity worth pursuing further. At this stage, which might vary from private equity firm to firm based on their style and their size, typically things that you would evaluate are the market opportunity of the company, its product, its competitive positioning, its management team, its growth opportunities, and any risks to the company from regulation, from reputation, or in its operation. And what this process looks like today is a team of analysts who basically scour the internet and pore over information to try and identify any of these risks about the company. They will look through things like company reported data, any industry research on the company, any regulatory fines about the company, any competitor reports, any earning calls of the competitors. And needless to say, this process is very inefficient. So it is clear that using a generative AI system here can actually drive enormous time efficiencies. It can almost render the old ways of doing pre-screening obsolete and drive new ways of doing this. But RAG AI offers distinctive advantage over generative AI. I'm going to talk about 4 ways, 4 things that make up the pre-screening process, and 4 ways in which RAG can help. The first one is summarizing the market and product descriptions of the company. So it's obvious. You can use an LLM, and you can generate these descriptions. But what you can do with RAG is make sure that these summaries are actually derived from credible and up-to-date sources. The second step, which is generating a competitive analysis of the company, which is typically a very time-consuming step because you have to find companies which are competitive to the original company that you're evaluating. If you use a RAG system, you can make sure that this competitor list is refined by referencing multiple databases. But more importantly, you can make sure it is refined by referencing your internal database. So any conversations that you've had with other companies in the past, you can incorporate all of that in your response as well. You can use it for risk identification, highlight potential risk to your investment. But what you can do with RAG is, 1, add a layer of trust, because you know that these risks are identified from credible data sources, and these are the latest risks that affect the company because you know that the data source is constantly updating. But you can also fine-tune it to identify those risks which are very material to your specific private equity firm, tailor it to your investment criteria. And finally, you can use it for drafting, pre-paper drafting for IC investment committee. A standard generative AI system can generate a basic skeleton of the IC draft, but using RAG, you can actually customize that draft to suit the investment criteria, to suit the investment process of your firm, driving enormous time efficiencies in the process. I want to show what that looks like with an example. So here's the response from a standard LLM. When you ask a question like, what are the current risks associated with Northumbrian Water, which is a water utility company based in the UK? I don't know if you can actually see the response on the screen. But if you look at it, all of the risks highlighted by a standard LLM are actually quite generic. None of them are specific to Northumbrian water. Regulatory risk, environmental risk, infrastructure aging, operational risks, very generic. Even if you try and hone down on one specific risk and you ask to highlight any historical environmental risks with Northumbrian water, you see that it only highlights actually one specific risk, pollution incidents. And even then, it doesn't have access to the latest data on what's happened with the company. And everything else is still quite generic. If you look at the response with a RAG system, this is a system that is developed by Auquan. So now when a user logs in as a private equity analyst and asks about risks associated with Northumbrian water, they're getting very specific risks that are associated with Northumbrian water. It includes everything from things like water leak disruptions, the fines that they have had for untreated sewage dump into the Thames River, even things as specific as Roker Beach sewage spill, which is a very recent incident up to, from 2 months back. And what's very interesting here is these risks are customized to that user. The system understands that this is a private equity user and is highlighting risks that are material only to them, not to a user who, for example, might be working in an investment bank. And if you look on the right, the response that you see here, that is the true power of RAG. You not only have a summary of the risk, like you would from an LLM system, you also have all of the underlying sources from where that summary has been identified. So as a user now, you log into the system, you see a high-level idea of all the risks associated with the company. If any risk looks material to you or to your private equity firm, you can dive deeper and look at a summary. And then if you really want to investigate that risk further, you can go to the original source. It helps you build that layer of analysis. So this was just one example of how a RAG system can help. But like I mentioned before, it can actually easily integrate into any knowledge-intensive workflow. On the risk side, there are multiple workflows in financial services where users are required to look through a mountain of information. For example, onboarding companies. If you have to onboard a company at an investment bank, you have to look through if the company is on any sanction lists, if the key people in the company, if the UBOs of the company are any politically exposed people, if the company has any recent regulatory fines, and RAG can automate all of that for you. You can use it for continued regulatory reporting and ongoing compliance, and you can use it for risk intelligence on your portfolio investments, on your loan book, or your counterparties. On the opportunity side, similarly, you can use it for equity and credit research, for M&A due diligence, for credit assessment, credit ratings, and also for ESG research, stewardship, and assessment. So I only had 15 minutes here, so I got to talk about RAG at a very high level and only highlight one use case for RAG. But for anybody who's interested, we just published a white paper, which you can find at the link that I have on the screen, or you can scan that QR code. And that goes into a lot more detail on how RAG works. And it goes into a lot more detail on each of the use cases of RAG. So please have a look at the white paper. And if there's anything of interest, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to have a chat with you. Or you can find me outside after the talk as well, and I'd be happy to talk to you more. Well, thank you for listening. And that is RAG, and enjoy the rest of the festival.